Today, we're going to look at 3 places you can't go and people who went there anyway. But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please sneak into the Like Button's house and replace all of their family photos of pictures of you wearing their clothes in the same poses. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. At 6:30 p.m. on May 14, 1955, a 24-year-old man named Donald Giroux stood next to his friend, 28-year-old Murray Anderson, on the shore of a natural spring in the state of Georgia. The spring was called Radium Springs because literally there was radium in the water. Radium is a naturally occurring, highly radioactive metallic element, but there were such low levels of it in the water that it wasn't really a hazard. However, the radium did have an effect on the water. It made it practically neon blue, and so it was totally mesmerizing. I mean, you look at this thing and you know there's something different about this spring. Also, this spring was incredibly deep. So Donald and Murray were both members of the US Navy, and so naturally they spent a lot of time, in and around water, because that's what the Navy does. They work in and around water. But ironically, it was actually when Donald and Murray were not working that they spent the most amount of time in the water, because in their off time, they were recreational scuba divers. Except back in 1955, recreational scuba diving was totally not safe. And that was because, underwater diving certainly existed at the time. I mean, institutions like the Navy, they were prolific divers. But civilians did not really dive on their own. And so as a result, if you wanted to recreationally scuba dive, well, you didn't really have access to good equipment or even proper equipment. I mean, there just wasn't anything available to you. And so for people like Donald and Murray who did want to go explore the underwater abyss on their own, they had to literally make their own diving equipment, like their own oxygen tanks and their own flashlights and goggles. I mean, all of it. I mean, it was amateur. It was homemade equipment. And so that's what made it really dangerous. On top of when you're underwater diving, as I've done myself, a lot of things can go wrong. And so that's also dangerous. And so the whole thing, it's asking for problems. But for Donald and Murray, it was actually the danger associated with recreational diving that made it so appealing. They liked the idea that other people were scared to go underwater, with their DIY equipment. For Donald and Murray, they loved it. They got a thrill out of it. And on top of that, they kind of felt like explorers. They got to go to places underwater where literally nobody else had gone before. In fact, they had already gone to other locations and mapped out, tunnels and underwater cave systems and all these different things that literally nobody else had done before. And they loved it. And today was going to be no different, because there were sections in Radium Springs that nobody had mapped, and they were going to go down there and see it for themselves. So after the two men looked at each other and nodded and just kind of gave the signal it was time to begin the dive, they donned their amateur equipment, their oxygen tanks and their goggles and their flippers, and then they walked into the neon blue water and submerged. A few minutes later, Donald and Murray had traveled about 70 feet straight down the water column. And at this point, the light is really fading. They can't really see too well. They did have flashlights that they had rigged up that they had waterproofed. But at this point, down 70 feet, it's getting pretty dark. But right in front of them, off to the side, was this huge entrance, this underwater tunnel entrance. And this was actually a well-known cavern. Like, this is actually where other recreational divers would go to if they went to Radium Springs. It was this cavern. But while the entrance to the cavern had been sort of mapped out and searched, there were all these little spidery offshoots once you got into this cavern that had not been explored. And so what Donald and Murray were going to do is go into the cavern and then basically start, splintering off and seeing what else was in there and mapping it out. Now, as much as Donald and Murray did like the sort of risks associated with this activity, they weren't completely reckless. They had attached a dive line when they had gone into the spring. that they attached to the surface and they fed down with them. It's a 200-foot line, and they carried it with them. The lead diver would basically unspool as they went. The two divers would be right next to each other, and they'd be holding on to this line. And so when they would go into this cavern, if for some reason they got turned around, or if they got totally confused, whatever it was, they could always just follow their line back out of the cavern, back up to the surface. This was not like rocket science. This is something that divers today still do. So using a dive line, very common practice, and Donald and Murray were doing just that. And so they went into this cavern, they got their dive line spooling out, and everything is totally fine. But once they were inside of this cavern, all the light completely went away. I mean, the cavern was relatively spacious, but the light is coming straight down, and this tunnel entrance is basically, horizontal. And so once they're inside of this cavern, it's utterly pitch black. But Donald and Murray have dove other underwater cave systems. They knew going in how dark this cave system was going to be. They had their flashlights, that they had jerry-rigged to be waterproof, and they're holding on to their line, and they're going into this cavern looking for their first offshoot. But as they're going into this cavern, there's all this silt, all this mud that's kind of caked to the walls and the floor that began getting kicked up from their flippers and bumping into it. And before long, because of the silt and the lack of light, they could basically only see maybe 6 inches in front of them. Like even shining their light, all they'd see is all the silt. And so very quickly, the visibility basically fell to 0. But, again, they're going in knowing this is the environment they're going into. They're confident, they're cool, they're moving along. But as the two divers were continuing through the cavern, getting deeper and deeper, and it's starting to get more and more restrictive, the deeper they go, they were about to go into this offshoot when Donald suddenly started seeing all these air bubbles coming up against him. And now he can't quite see where they're coming from, but there's only one place that an air bubble could be emerging from, and that's from his oxygen tank. And so clearly there's some sort of issue. He can't see because it's so dark. He also has homemade equipment, and so the risk of catastrophic failure is pretty high with his equipment. And so he begins trying to figure out where this leak is coming from, checking his equipment, trying to make it stop, but he can't. He can't really communicate to Walter, who's got the spool of dive line, who's continuing straight forward into this offshoot. He can't quite tell him what's going on. They can't actually speak to each other. Again, it's pitch black, there's silt, it's sort of, claustrophobic and stressful. And so ultimately, Donald grabs Murray and just tries to shake him and sort of signal, hey, I got an issue here, but he had no way of knowing if Murray actually understood. But Donald, he knew he just had to get out of there. He had to go back to the surface and fix his issue before it got way worse. And so, even though he knew he was kind of leaving his buddy here, he's thinking, okay, Murray's got the dive line, he's experienced, I just grabbed him, everything's gonna be okay. And Donald turned around, kicked up more silt, and held onto that dive line, but now followed it back out of the cavern and back up to the surface. And when he got to the surface, he took a big breath, he was saved, he checked his equipment and realized, wherever the issue was, and he was actually able to fix the issue. And so before long, after only being on the surface for a couple of minutes, he had put his equipment back on, he was back in the water, and following the dive line back down towards the cavern. As Donald began his descent down towards that cavern, 70 feet down, the whole time he's holding onto the dive line, making sure he doesn't lose that. But really what he's focused on is checking his equipment, because as he's going down, he's got basic visibility here. It's not gonna be like in the cavern where you can't see anything. And so as he's going down, he's checking his equipment and just making sure that there isn't a leak. And by the time he got all the way down 70 feet and the dive line turned and went into that cavern, Donald was feeling pretty good that his equipment was good, it was not malfunctioning, and it was safe to go back into the cavern with Murray. And so that's what he does. He's got his flashlight in one hand, he's got the dive line in the other, and he's now looking straight into this dark opening of this cavern, and in Donald goes, the whole time holding onto that dive line. And pretty much immediately, once inside the cavern, the flashlight became useless because again, the silt's still kicked up, there's no current running through this cavern, so the silt is not going anywhere. But either way, Donald knew what he was doing. He was going straight in there to connect with Murray and continue this dive and see what else is in here and, map it out for other divers. And so into the cavern he goes. He's holding the dive line in one hand. He's got his flashlight and he's going deeper and deeper into this cavern. And the whole time he's expecting at any moment he's just going to bump into Murray. But he just keeps going and going deeper and deeper into the system. The walls are getting tighter and tighter around him. And eventually he reaches the very end of the dive line, 200 feet at this point, deep into this cavern. And there's no Murray. Murray's gone. Now Donald, he's looking around. Remember, it's total darkness. All he's got is this flashlight, which basically just illuminates the silt that's been kicked up all around him. But where he is at this exact moment, the silt wasn't too bad. It was just like this abyss all around him. It's totally black. There's nothing around him. And in a sudden panic, Donald thinks, oh my goodness, I'm so far into this cavern, I haven't found Murray, like something's happened to him. He's run out of air or he's gotten lost. Like, how could he have let go of the dive line? What's going on here? And so Donald immediately just starts going down to the bottom of the cave and searching the ground, thinking that, maybe Murray got to this point and passed out and sunk to the bottom, but he gets to the bottom of the cave, there's nothing there, he starts feeling the tunnels, there's nothing, and at this point he's kicked up even more silt, and so, he really can't see anything. And he's thinking, it took me a while to get in here, and I'm running low on oxygen right now. I need to get help immediately, because Murray, he's gonna run out of time really quickly here. And so Donald, he turns around and holding onto this dive line, he pulls himself out of the cavern. He goes back to the surface. Some part of him was hoping that when he got up there that he would just magically see Murray waiting for him, but nope, he's all alone. There's nobody here. And at that point, Donald took off his gear and he contacted authorities. Not long after that, 2 commercial divers, along with an entire US Navy dive team, arrived at Radium Springs and began looking for Murray. And they searched and they searched and they couldn't find him until 8 a.m. the next morning, 12 hours after Donald had surfaced. It would turn out when Donald had that malfunction that caused him to leave the cavern and leave Murray behind and go to the surface and fix himself and then go back down again. Well, in that space of time that he was away from Murray continued to spool out the dive line, maybe not necessarily knowing that Donald had left him at this point, and Murray got all the way to the end of the dive line, 200 feet, and at that point, in this uncharted tunnel he was in, somehow or another, Murray became disconnected from the dive line. Maybe he let go of it, maybe he bumped into something, we don't know, but either way, he let go of the dive line, basically right at the end of the dive line. And when Donald came back down and got to the end of that dive line and discovered Murray wasn't there, well, what he didn't know is that Murray actually was just a couple of feet away. He was basically right above him, because that's where Murray was ultimately found. He had drowned literally feet away from the dive line, but Donald, he couldn't see him, and in a total panic state, in an effort to find Murray, Donald began fumbling around, going down and rubbing up against the bottom and the walls, kicking up all this silt. And you gotta figure at this exact moment, Murray, who's very much alive at this point, almost certainly, is right above him, and now his visibility, which was already terrible, he's probably scared to death because he's looking for this dive line, and now the silt is just getting kicked up all around him. He probably knows Donald's nearby. He's swimming around looking for Donald. Donald's looking for Murray. They swim right past each other. It's absolute madness. But then eventually Donald just vanishes because he's going to find help. And Murray is left all by himself in total darkness, disoriented, terrified, has no idea where the dive line is. Silt is making it impossible to know what direction he's even going. And so in Murray's final moments, he just scrambled around trying to find his way out again until he eventually drowned, again, just feet away from his dive line, the very thing that would have brought him to safety. Hey guys, did you know you can get your strange, dark, and mysterious fix anytime, anywhere with the Mr. Ballin podcast on Amazon Music? Well, you can. There are tons of stories waiting to be binged right now, plus there are exclusive stories on there that have never been shared on this YouTube channel. Amazon Music listeners get to listen to new episodes an entire month before everybody else. You can also listen to my other show, Mr. Ballin's Medical Mysteries, 2 weeks early and totally ad-free on Amazon Music. If you're already a Prime member, well, you already have access to those 2 shows, plus hundreds of other top podcasts ad-free, all at no extra cost. That's right, your Prime membership includes Amazon Music absolutely free. So if you're ready to dive deeper into strange, dark, and mysterious stories, well, go download the Amazon Music app today and listen to the Mr. Ballin podcast and also Mr. Ballin's Medical Mysteries. Now, back to today's stories. On May 28, 2022, a photographer named April Vertucci, along with two of her friends, snuck towards this abandoned funeral home in Flint, Michigan. The funeral home was a big brick building right off a main road in the center of the city, and April and her two friends knew there were lots of people that were kind of looking in this direction, and it was illegal to go into this property, and so very carefully they snuck their way towards the back door of the building, and they saw the door was, completely attached to its hinges. It was in good shape, appeared to be locked, but they thought, what the heck? They walked up to the door, took a look around. April reached down, tried the handle, and it pulled right open. And as soon as this happened, April was psyched, because not only was she a photographer, but she was also an urban explorer, which meant she would sneak into places like this, abandoned buildings and other man-made sites, just to have a look around. One, because it was fun and exciting, but also because she got to use her photography, taking cool pictures of places like this funeral home. And so April's friends were also into urban exploring, and as soon as this door came open, it was like, oh my goodness, I can't believe we're gonna get to explore this legendary site. So this funeral home had been shut down about 5 years earlier because of reports of unsanitary conditions inside. Anonymous reporters had gone in and discovered that there were literally like human remains out. There were up to 40 bodies being stored in one room with no air conditioning, so they're just rotting. There's maggots all over the place. There's embalming liquids on the ground. There's blood everywhere. I mean, basically, this place was like the site of a horror movie. And so the state comes in, they shut this place down, and the owner, after being shut down, just abandons the building, just leaves it exactly the way they had left it. I mean, the bodies were removed by the state, but all the equipment for the funeral home was just left behind. Everything was sealed up, and that was that. And the place was deemed off limits. But naturally, urban explorers found out about this and began going in to see this horror show for themselves. And so April and her friends, they had heard about this place and immediately were like, we gotta go in there, we gotta see it for ourselves. And so they hopped in a car and they drove over 3 hours from Ohio to Michigan just to check this place out. And now here they were, door open, and in they go. Once the door shut behind them, April and her two friends were looking down this long, dark hallway. It's totally silent inside. The walls were made out of cinder block that had been painted white, but the paint was all chipping off, and they had their flashlights out, and it's dark and creepy, and they're looking down the hallway, and just for a second, they just stop and listen to see if anybody else is inside of here moving around. Maybe other urban explorers or even other animals or anything, squatters, they don't know, but they're sitting there for a second just listening, and they don't hear anything. And so with April in front, they begin walking down this hallway. And as they're walking, there's all this trash on the ground. It's totally eerie as they're walking. Every little sound is sort of startling them. They're kind of laughing as they're going. And eventually, April stops in front of this first door that she sees, the first door off the hallway, and it's closed. And right across the center of this door is this big caution sign saying, stay back. And then underneath the caution sign, it says formaldehyde. And so April and her friends knew that, okay, well, formaldehyde is a chemical used to embalm bodies, something funeral homes did. And so they know that behind this door very likely was the embalming room, where funeral homes would literally pump dead bodies full of formaldehyde and prep the bodies, to be presented at the wake, before they're actually laid to rest. It's like this is where actual dead bodies are manipulated. And so April and her friends are pretty excited. And so April's, she opens up the door and they look inside of this room, and it's very eerie. It's pretty much vacant, but in the center of this room, it's all dark. They have their flashlights, right? In the center of the room is this metal table, this standalone metal table. It's like a gurney, and it's where the dead body would be placed as they're being embalmed. And then on the walls all around are all these shelves with various tools and, vials of various milky liquids. There's a saw, there's scissors, there's scalpels. On the ground, there's, fabric that appears to have some sort of bodily fluids on it. I mean, this really looks like the scene of a horror movie. But for April and her friends, it's like, this is a gold mine. I mean, this is what we came here for. And so April and her friends, for the next little bit, they just began walking all around the embalming room. April taking photos, and her friends and April kind of moving things around, seeing what was in there. And then eventually, they left and they continued to search the building, and they found a chapel where there were caskets laying around. They also went into a garage and they found there was an old hearse just left inside the garage. I mean, the place really was as creepy as everybody said it was. And so it was sometime around discovering the garage that the girls had gone back to the main hallway, and they discovered this other door that they hadn't seen when they were searching over the first 30 minutes they had been in there. And this door led to this ominous stairwell that went down into what appeared to be the basement. And so at this point, the girls felt like they had sort of searched the entire main floor, and, the two friends, not April, they really wanted to go down these steps and explore the basement. They'd been here long enough that it seemed pretty clear that they were the only ones there. It had been totally quiet, and even though it was creepy, ultimately, they sort of felt safe at this point. And April did too, but she also was having a great time still taking pictures on the first floor. And so at this point, the group decided to split up. The two friends would go down into the basement, and April, for a little bit longer, would stay up on the first floor and just continue taking photos, and then she would join them. And so, no big deal, they split up, the girls go down to the basement, April's taking her photos, doing her thing, and just a couple of minutes later, April hears her friends in the basement, through the floors, yelling out something to the effect of, "Oh my gosh, is that real?" And then the other friend is like, "Yes, that is real, oh my gosh." And so April, she runs to that doorway, she goes down the stairs, and she finds her friends at the foot of the stairs. And they're looking out into the main space of the basement that April can't quite see yet. And so she goes right down to her friends, she's looking at them, they look horrified, they're looking out at something obviously terrible in the basement. And April turns from her friends to the basement, and what she sees makes no sense. There's just like this empty basement, with some stuff pushed up against the walls, but in the middle of the basement is what appears to be like this standalone metal jail cell. Like, imagine metal rungs that you would imagine in a jail, but all the way around. It's about 8 feet tall, 10 feet wide, 4 feet deep. It's just this inexplicable standalone jail cell. At least that's the way April interpreted it, and so did her friends. And as she's looking at it, April, she sees that in the middle of the jail cell, if you will, is like this big metal box that's just sitting on the floor in the center of the cell, and then right above it, in the ceiling, is this pretty big cutout, like a hole in the ceiling. And so April sees this and takes in what she's seeing, and she can't really process it. She doesn't really understand what this is. And she's looking at her friends, and they're so horrified. They've been yelling out about something being real, like, what is that? Oh my gosh. And she's kind of looking back and forth, and then she sees it. She sees there's something else inside of this jail cell. And when she sees it, she recoils in horror. She grabs her friends. They sprint out of the funeral home, and they call the authorities. When authorities arrived, they went right down into the basement and they looked inside of that jail cell, and quickly they determined that April and her friends had not been alone inside of this building like they had thought. It would turn out 6 days earlier, a local man who had nothing to do with April and her friends, totally separate, had gone to this funeral home to have a look around. Except he wasn't an urban explorer. He was not going in here to have a good time or take photos. He was going inside to steal scrap metal and try to sell it for a profit. And so he made his way inside the funeral home, he looked around, he didn't really find much, but eventually went down into the basement, and when he got down there, he turned, he looked out at that space down there, and he saw this jail cell, this metal jail cell that just kind of sat in the middle of the basement. Except what he would have seen is just the bars that sort of surrounded the outside of the cell, the actual cell itself. The metal box in the middle that was on the floor that April saw and her friend saw, that was not there, and the hole in the ceiling would not have been there. He would have just seen basically a lot of metal in the middle of the basement. So he's thinking, I've hit the jackpot. This is exactly what I've come here for, to take this metal and go sell it. And so this man, he goes into the jail cell, into this cage, and he quickly realizes the actual metal struts that made up the cage, even if they were super valuable, they were thick and difficult to cut through, and so realistically, they were going to be really hard to extricate and get out of this place. But when the man is actually inside of this jail cell, this cage, he sees there's actually some other metal that he hadn't seen when he first came down that might be far easier to extract. Basically, right in the middle of this cell were additional metal rods that were running from the ceiling down to the ground. They were far thinner and easier to move around, and he's thinking, I could actually cut these and get these out of here and turn a profit on them, and then come back at a later date with, more people or more powerful tools to cut the metal that sort of was the cage, the stuff that he had originally seen. And so, feeling pretty optimistic, the guy put his stuff down, his phone, his wallet, his other things off to the side, in the cage. And then he got out his bolt cutters and he cut the very first one of these thinner cables right in the middle of the cell. And as soon as he cut one of them, there was this loud rumbling sound he would have heard right above him. And then this big metal box came crashing down and pinned him to the ground. It would turn out what this man had walked inside of was not a jail cell in the basement of the funeral home. It was actually the inner workings of something known as a casket lift. Basically, the funeral home has to raise caskets from the basement where potentially they're stored up to the main floor to be used. And, they're pretty cumbersome, big things that need to get moved around. And so effectively, they have an elevator that brings them up. And so that big metal box that came crashing down on this guy was the actual lift itself that actually carried up the caskets. And the cord that he cut were actually the cords that supported that lift. And so as soon as he cut one of them, he was cutting the support to effectively the elevator car that was right above him that then fell and crushed him. However, he didn't die from getting crushed. He just got trapped. And as soon as he realized he was trapped and being kind of crushed to death here, he reached for his phone, but he realized his phone was just barely outside of his reach. He couldn't get to his phone. And nobody knew he was here. This was an illegal activity. He didn't broadcast where he was going. And so he's stuck. He can't call anyone, and no one knows he's here. And so for 6 days, that lift gradually crushed this man to death. And then finally, when April and her friends showed up and they went down in the basement, they didn't just see, this destroyed casket lift. They saw this dead man's body, and he was literally outstretched, still reaching for his phone. On the morning of September 10th, 1987, Police Constable Dick Ellis walked into an interview room in a police station in South Yorkshire, England. Inside of this room was a table, and sitting on the other side of this table were these two security guards. One was named Stephen Brooks, and the other was named David Goldthorpe. And from PC Ellis's perspective, his first impression of these two guys is they were like big, burly, tough-looking men. He could tell they were both visibly shaken, like something had really rattled both of these guys. However, before Ellis could even sit down and begin asking basic questions about what was going on here, these two security guards just launched into this totally crazy-sounding story. The men told Ellis that the night before, they had been patrolling this construction site where workers were building a 6-mile stretch of highway and bridge that were called the Stocks Bridge Bypass. Now, at this time of night, there was nobody at the site, no workers, nothing like that. And so really it was the security guard's job to make sure nobody entered the site and either tampered with equipment or tried to steal anything. Now, the night had been very routine and quiet until around midnight. It was at that point that David and Stephen, these two security guards, had reached the bridge, the half-constructed bridge portion of this bypass. And as they're walking along the highway and they see the bridge out in front of them, they stopped because they saw clearly there was a figure standing on this bridge. It almost looked like a man who was wearing a long jacket, like a cloak or something, and he appeared to be staring down below the bridge, down towards the valley underneath what the bridge was actually going over. Like this man clearly had not spotted the security guards. And so naturally, they began calling out to this guy, asking him like, hey, what are you doing here? What's going on? This is a private construction site, like you need to go. But the guy on the bridge didn't react. He just kept staring down to the valley below. And so at that point, as the two security guards are now walking in the direction of this guy, one of them lifts up his flashlight and shines it at this man. And when he does, the beam of light appears to just go through this man's body, like his body isn't solid, and the light just passed right through. And as soon as they did that, both Stephen and David just stopped, shocked at what they're seeing, aiming this light at the sky. And as they're doing this, the figure appeared to kind of turn and look at David and Stephen. And they were so unsettled and terrified by it that instead of protecting the construction site, they just turned and ran, and they went to the police. Now, after P.C. Ellis had been told this story, he did not believe in any way that what they had experienced was supernatural. He's thinking, okay, clearly, you saw some guy and, maybe he shouldn't have been there and maybe it was a trick of the light or something, or maybe that wasn't a person at all and you just thought it was. Like, who knows? But there has to be a logical, rational explanation here. And so feeling kind of annoyed that he was called in to deal with this, Ellis looks at these two guys and he's like, look, this is not a police matter. Why don't you guys, if you're so shaken up by this, go talk to the church or something. Like, this is not something we can help you with. And at that, the two security guards just said, okay, and they got up and they left. And Ellis, truthfully, didn't think about this at all. It was like, okay, great, that's done. I don't got to deal with that. And he went on with his day. But later that day, Ellis got a call from his boss being like, hey, did you tell two security guards who came in here to go talk to the church about some ghosts they saw at a construction site or something? And at this, Ellis had to kind of explain what had happened and how he had sort of flippantly told them to, go see the church if they really thought they saw a ghost. But his boss was like, well, they took you literally, and they are currently at the local church, those two security guards right now, and they are refusing to leave unless the church helps them with this ghost situation. And so Ellis's boss told him that you just need to go to the church, get these two guys to calm down, and leave. Go do that right now. And so Ellis is like, I can't believe they took that seriously. Okay, fine. So he hops in his cruiser, he goes to the church, he finds these two guys who are still totally shaken up, and they're pleading with people to take them seriously. Somebody needs to go out there and see what's on the bridge, see what this could have been. And Ellis is like, guys, I will tonight go to the bridge, I will check it out, I'll see what's going on there if you leave the church and you don't come back. Like, leave these people alone. And at this, David and Stephen, they're totally relieved. They're like, oh, you will? Oh my gosh, great. We'll leave, thank you, let us know what you find. And they left the church. And so they left, and P.C. Ellis is like, okay, great, I guess tonight I'm gonna go looking for ghosts. And so that night, around midnight, P.C. Ellis and his partner drove over to the construction site. Specifically, they went to the bridge. They got on the road that actually went underneath this unfinished bridge, and they camped out on this lower road. Looking straight up in front of them was this bridge. They're basically just going to monitor this bridge because that's where the security guards claim to have seen this figure, this ghost. They're going to stake out this bridge, see what happens, call it good. Now, at first, nothing happened on this bridge. Ellis and his partner just sat there staring, bored up at this bridge, waiting for, the time to pass by so they could leave. But at some point, Ellis noticed movement up on the bridge, and so did his partner. Now, they couldn't quite tell what it was, and they couldn't even see if it was still moving around anymore, but clearly something had moved on the bridge. And so for a couple of seconds, Ellis and his partner are just staring really intently up at the bridge, waiting to see something else happen, but, nothing else did. And so Ellis is like, well, I gotta go up there and check because, maybe there is some guy who's trespassing on the construction site and that's what the security guard saw. Like, I gotta go up there and see because from down here, we really can't see too well. And so Ellis told his partner to just stay put in the car, that he, Ellis, would go up on the bridge and have a look around. And so Ellis, he got out of the car, all he had was a flashlight, and he began walking over to the bottom of this bridge. And there was actually a ladder he would have to climb up to the actual bridge, because remember, they're on the road below this bridge. And so Ellis, he gets to the ladder, he begins climbing up the ladder, and as he's going up, he's kind of staring up, almost expecting somebody to poke their head over, but, it's quiet, no one's looking over the edge. And eventually, Ellis gets to the top, and he climbs onto the bridge, and again, it's this unfinished bridge, there's no traffic up here, and he looks roughly in the direction of where he thought he saw movement when he was down in the car looking up here, which also happened to be roughly the area where the two security guards had described seeing the figure that their light had shone through. And sure enough, Ellis looks and he sees there's this cloaked figure standing a little ways off of the side of the bridge, apparently just looking down towards his police car. And Ellis, at first, he's kind of shocked. He can't believe that, there's some legitimacy to the story these guys had told, and he couldn't help but be kind of frightened for a second. But then Ellis raised his flashlight and shined it at this figure, and as soon as he did, he just laughed. Because all it was a plastic tarp wrapped around some construction equipment. Like, that's what the security guards clearly had seen. And, when they shine their light, it's a clear plastic tarp here. The light could theoretically go through it. You can kind of see how they would think, oh my gosh, it's a ghost. And so Ellis is like, this is all this was. This was nothing. I knew it was nothing, and now I know it's nothing. And so after doing a cursory walk around the bridge to, make sure nobody was up there, and, he looked around, there wasn't anybody there, Ellis went back to the ladder, climbed back down, got in the car with his partner, and explained to him that this whole thing was a joke. And of course, there's no ghost, there's no criminals, there's nothing. This is no big deal. Now, Ellis and his partner could have, at this point, just left and gone home, but they had told their boss they'd come out here for at least an hour, and, they'd only been here for maybe 30 minutes at this point. And so the two of them decided, you know what, just because we said we would, let's just stay here a little bit longer and make sure nobody goes on this bridge. We'll give it another, 30 minutes or so. And so Ellis and his partner just kind of sit back in their seats and settle in for this last little stretch of their shift. However, about 20 minutes into this final 30 minutes, Ellis is still just sitting there, his window's open, and he's just kind of doing nothing, waiting around, when suddenly he's hit with this unbelievably cold gust of air that comes into the car through his window. And it's kind of like sudden, like he's being hit with this gust of cold air. And then at the same time, Ellis began feeling this incredible pressure on his chest. Like it was so intense, he thought he was having a heart attack, and he wanted to say something to his partner, but it was like he couldn't even move. He's like frozen, he's getting scared, he doesn't know what's happening. And as much as he wanted to like yell out and get his partner's attention to help him, he suddenly had this overwhelming feeling that there was someone off to the side staring at him, someone right outside the car. And even though he didn't want to look, he found himself slowly turning and looking out his open window. And right there, immediately outside the door, is this man standing practically pressed up against the window. His torso is inches away from Ellis's face, just standing there inexplicably. Like this guy snuck up on them. They didn't even hear him. And so Ellis, at this point, he breaks out of his sort of trance. He screams and gets his partner's attention. And then he pushes open his door and he jumps out to confront this person who snuck up on them. But there's no one outside the car. And so Ellis, he turns to his partner and he's like, hey, did you just see what I just saw? Did you see that guy? And Ellis's partner, who's totally ashen-faced, just looks at Ellis and he's like, yeah, I did see him. And so after looking around for a couple more seconds, Ellis climbed back into the car, and then he and his partner debriefed what had just happened. And Ellis's partner would tell Ellis that from his seat, he actually had a better vantage point than Ellis did to seeing this guy. I mean, Ellis was basically right on top of this guy, but his partner was a little bit farther back and had a better angle. And he would tell Ellis that at some point he had turned and seen the guy standing there. And the guy, he was wearing this old coat, this long coat that sort of looked like it belonged in the 1800s or something. And the partner would say, like, he didn't hear this guy approach. He didn't know how he got there. But at some point, he said the guy in the coat, the guy outside, crouched down just enough that he was looking in the car in the direction of Ellis's partner. And Ellis's partner said he was staring right at the guy, but the guy, he had no face. Ultimately, Ellis and his partner would return to the station that night, and they would file a report about what happened to them. But they would simply describe it as inexplicable phenomenon, and after filing it, they basically hoped they would never have to talk about it again. Except that wouldn't be possible, because shortly after filing that report, the construction was finished, and so the highway and the bridge were open to the public. And pretty much right away, people started dying on that bridge. Like a crazy high number of people just inexplicably would get in these fatal accidents on the bridge. And this bridge was not like especially hazardous. It was a beautiful brand new bridge. I mean, there really should not have been this many accidents. But it was not just that so many people were dying on this bridge inexplicably. No, also in tandem with all the fatal accidents were all the independently reported sightings of this dark figure standing on the bridge that had no face. So the leading theory amongst people who believe what's happening at this bridge is basically paranormal is that the construction of this bridge and the highway disturbed a gravesite, and that has led to all the tragedy and death that has followed. But they've never actually been able to prove if there really was a gravesite where this bridge or the highway was built. The two security guards, Stephen Brooks and David Goldthorpe, both quit their jobs. As for Ellis and his partner, they've never changed their stories, and they also have never found a reasonable explanation for what they saw. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. On the morning of December 10th, 1995, a seasoned homicide detective walked into a house on a quiet street in the suburbs of Tucson, Arizona. Another officer led him down the hallway to a bedroom, and when the detective looked inside, he froze. Now, he'd seen a lot of crime scenes before, but this one had to be one of the worst. I mean, there was blood everywhere. All over the walls, all over the floors, the mattress. I mean, it was just a complete nightmare. But as much as it appeared like clearly he's looking at the scene of a murder, there was a problem. There was no body. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times a week. So if that's of interest to you, please hide mousetraps in all of the like button shoes. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the morning of December 8th, 1995, a 41-year-old mother named Bonnie Sanborn set a box of cereal down on the dining room table inside of her home in Tucson, Arizona. She then called for her 3 kids to come eat breakfast, and just a few seconds later, her youngest son, 10-year-old Brandon, came bombing into the room and sat down at the table. Bonnie then poured herself a cup of coffee and carried it down the hallway to her 13-year-old daughter Candace's room. Candace was busy putting on makeup, and when Bonnie reminded her that it was almost time to leave for school, she just rolled her eyes and said, she'd be out in a minute. Then Bonnie continued going down the hallway and knocked on the door of her 15-year-old son Bradley's room. And when he didn't open the door, she shouted through the door that if he didn't get out of bed soon, she would come in there and literally drag him out. But there was still no response after she did this, so Bonnie put her ear to the door and listened for movement. She was hoping to hear sheets rustling or dresser drawers opening, but she didn't hear those sounds. Instead, she heard a different sound. It was like this weird clanking sound, like metal pounding against metal. And so because this noise was so unusual, she just opened up the door, and she found her son, Bradley, along with his friend, 18-year-old Jason Horbachevsky, squatting in the middle of the room, trying to pry open this big metal box with a crowbar and a hammer. Bonnie stepped fully inside the room to get a better look, and she saw there was a phone receiver dangling off the side of this metal box. It was clearly a payphone that Bradley and Jason had clearly stolen from somewhere out on the street, and now they were trying to, steal the quarters out from inside of it. Bonnie was so shocked that all she could think to do was just say, "What are you doing?" And Bradley, he looked at his mom and just seemed totally unfazed that she was in there, and he just said, "What? We're just trying to get the change out of this payphone." And then before she could react to that, Jason, so her son's friend, he looked over his shoulder at her also very nonchalantly and just began laughing in a way that made Bonnie wonder if he was high on something. At this point, Bonnie just stepped back into the hallway and just tried to think through what she should even do here. I mean, this is so obvious that they're committing a crime in her house right now. Like, what in the world? But at the same time, she'd been having problems with her son Bradley for a long time now. This was definitely not the first time she had caught her son, doing something bad. Her son had been known to throw parties in their house that he definitely was not supposed to. He would pick fights with basically everybody in the house, all the family members. And on top of that, she also knew that periodically he would hang out with known gang members. Now, for a while, Bonnie had tried to be understanding and supportive, because she remembered how hard it was to be a teenager herself. But her son's trouble really just kept escalating. And this payphone thing was like a breaking point. She knew she could not let something like this slide. I mean, it was literally criminal, and so obviously so. And if she didn't step in now, it was clear her son would just continue to push the limits further and further until he got hurt or got somebody else hurt or, wound up in jail or something. Like, this was the moment she had to put her foot down. And so, without saying another word to her son or Jason, who were now back to banging on this metal box, she just turned and walked back into the kitchen where her other kids, Brandon and Candace, were now eating their breakfast and looking annoyed by all the chaos being caused by their older brother. And she walked right past them, picked up the phone, and she called 911. And when the dispatcher picked up her call, Bonnie said she wanted to report a theft, and she gave the dispatcher her own address. And then after she hung up, she told Candace and Brandon to go get their backpacks and go outside so they didn't miss the bus. A few minutes later, Bonnie heard a knock on the front door, and she opened it up to find two sheriff's deputies standing on the doorstep. She actually recognized the deputies, and she knew they also recognized her, because this was not the first time they'd been called to the Sanborn house. They'd been there several times actually recently to deal with domestic issues largely caused by her son. But Bonnie knew, Bradley, even though he was the obvious main problem, at least in terms of her current issues, she was already seeing that her 13-year-old child, Candace, had begun acting out a lot lately. And she was also worried what would happen when her 10-year-old, Brandon, became a teenager himself. Like, would he begin, following the footsteps of his brother and maybe his older sister as well? She didn't know, but she just couldn't understand why her kids just were misbehaving so much. Like, what did she do wrong? And so Bonnie showed the deputies to Bradley's room, where he and Jason were still actively trying to pry open this payphone. And when Bradley looked up and saw the police, he looked furious. He screamed at his mother that he couldn't believe she'd called the cops on him. But Bonnie, she did her best to push down the natural bit of guilt she was feeling, because she didn't want to have to call the cops on her son. The deputies ultimately handcuffed both Bradley and Jason, and they walked them outside, and Bonnie trailed right behind them. And then as the police were putting the kids in the back of the squad car, Bonnie pulled one of the deputies aside and asked if he could make sure Bradley spent at least one night in the juvenile detention center. She knew this was a very tough love sort of approach. I mean, basically demanding your kid stays effectively in jail overnight. But she was also hoping that in addition to being maybe scared straight here, he would also get counseling in the juvenile detention center and maybe begin to see the value of staying out of trouble. The deputy nodded and said he'd see what he could do. As the squad car drove away, Bonnie saw movement in a window of the house across the street. She squinted and saw that one of her neighbors was peering out the curtains to get a look at all the commotion. And then further down the street, a couple out for a morning jog had slowed down and was just staring at the squad car as they passed by. And now for Bonnie, she wasn't that surprised. She'd be looking out the window too if police showed up on her street. But at the same time, it still made her very embarrassed. She knew people in this neighborhood were already very aware of her family's problems, and it was a lot to bear. And frankly, making it even worse was the fact that, generally speaking, Bonnie's neighbors were nice to her in person when they were face to face with her. People even went out of their way to help her, but she knew behind her back, people in this neighborhood gossiped constantly about her family. Now, for Bonnie, this was obviously humiliating and also very frustrating because how could she possibly stop gossip? She couldn't. But more than just disliking the fact that there were all these people talking about her, she also just felt very isolated right now. She was married, but her husband Robert had gotten a job in Maryland, and he only came home every other weekend. Bonnie had actually tried to sell the house in Tucson and move the whole family to Maryland, but she'd eventually decided it just wasn't really worth the trouble. Plus, Robert had already talked to his supervisor about potentially transferring back to Tucson, and he was supposed to be coming back for good just next week. And so at this point, Bonnie was just trying to survive here. She still felt very isolated, but she knew, Robert, he'd be back soon, and she wouldn't be alone anymore, and she would get to deal with the kids, with the nosy neighbors, with the police, with her partner. It just felt like that would be a whole lot better. About 16 hours later, around 11:45 p.m. that night, Bonnie brushed her teeth and put on her PJs. The house was quiet for once, except for the TV humming in the living room. She'd gotten a call from the juvenile detention center that afternoon, and Bradley was being held there on theft charges, which Bonnie thought was for the best. But his friend Jason was 18 years old, so he was not held. Instead, he was just given a ticket and released the same day. And Bonnie knew that as soon as Bradley was out again, he and Jason would reconnect right away and just fall right back into their same old antics. Before she went to bed, Bonnie went to the living room where her other two kids, Candace and Brandon, were on the couch watching TV. And she told them it was time for bed, time to turn off the TV and go to your rooms, but they just ignored her and just continued to watch TV. It was a Friday night, and the two kids didn't have anywhere to be in the morning, and Bonnie had just done enough fighting for the day. So she just decided, you know what? Let them stay up. They can go to bed when they want to. And so she told the kids to, don't stay up too late and go to bed soon. Then she left, leaving them on the couch. She went to her own bedroom and she turned out her lights. A few hours later, Bonnie woke up and looked over at the clock and saw it was near 3 a.m. And she also could still hear the TV on out in the living room. And so Bonnie cracked open her door and yelled down the hallway to the kids to turn off the TV and go to bed. And then as Bonnie got back in her bed, she heard the sound of the TV turning off and she heard footsteps walking down the hallway, and then the house was quiet. And she drifted back to sleep. But sometime before dawn, when it was still dark out, she woke up again. And when she rolled over in her bed, she opened her eyes and she saw there was a large figure standing over her bed. Later that same morning, around 10:45 a.m., 10-year-old Brandon woke up to an eerily silent house. Normally, his mother would have already been awake, making breakfast or getting started on chores. But when he went out in the hallway, he didn't hear her. He went into the kitchen and he checked to see if she was there, but she wasn't. And there were no dirty pans or plates in the sink and no coffee in the pot. It looked like his mom hadn't even woke up yet, which was weird for a Saturday morning. So he went to ask his older sister, Candace, if she knew where their mom was. But Candace said she hadn't seen her. So Brandon and Candace both went down the hallway to their mother's bedroom. They knocked on the door, and when she didn't answer, Brandon pushed the door open and looked inside. And what he saw made him gasp in horror. The bedroom was covered in blood, but the bedroom was also empty. His mom wasn't in there. Let me tell you about my newfound favorite treat. The other day, I had some family and friends over, and I couldn't wait to introduce them to my mochi. We all shared the mango, the strawberry, and cookies and cream, and unsurprisingly, everybody loved it. We even made a quick run to the supermarket afterwards to get more. Because sometimes the most simple pleasures in life bring the most joy, like the joyfully chill sensation of biting into refreshing, creamy, chewy My Mochi ice cream. My Mochi ice cream is like this sweet ice cream dumpling. Creamy, premium ice cream wrapped in very satisfying, sweet, chewy dough that is both refreshing and indulgent. It comes in delicious flavors like strawberry, cookies and cream, and mango. My Mochi is only around 70 calories per piece, and it's easy to share because each box comes with 6 individual mochis. If you haven't tried My Mochi, you really don't want to miss out on this joyfully chill experience. Look for the purple box of My Mochi ice cream in the freezer aisle of your local grocery store. Later that same morning, Detective Brad Faust pulled up outside of a house in the suburbs of Tucson. He was there to investigate a mother's apparent kidnapping from her own home. Faust was actually feeling a bit frustrated to be called out to yet another case like this when he was already juggling so many others. 1995 had proven to be the deadliest year in Tucson's history. There had already been nearly 100 murders just that year, and the Pima County Sheriff's Office was swamped. But as far as anyone knew at this point, this was not a murder, it was a kidnapping. All Faust had been told was that Bonnie Sanborn was missing, and her kids had called 911 after seeing that and also seeing all the blood in her bedroom. So Faust was holding out hope here that this was actually nothing that serious, and that they would find Bonnie relatively quickly and she'd be okay. He got out of his car and he saw that officers had already taped off the house. There was a young boy and girl sitting out on the front curb, looking terrified and visibly distraught. And Faust also noticed that there was blood on both of their shirts, and so he figured that they must be Bonnie's kids, the ones who had made the 911 call, and he made a mental note that he would need to talk to them later. Then he walked through the front yard and went into the house. And right away, a crime scene photographer greeted him and then led him down the hallway. As he walked, Faust caught a glimpse of a family photo on the wall, which showed Bonnie and her husband and their 3 kids, all smiling and looking like the perfect all-American family. Before opening the door to Bonnie's bedroom, the photographer paused and warned the detective that there really was a lot of blood in here. Faust nodded, and then the photographer opened the door, and Faust immediately saw what he was talking about. I mean, there was blood spattered all over the walls, the floor, the windows, and the mattress. He felt his heart sink as he realized that with this much blood loss, they probably would not be finding their victim alive here. But he knew it was going to be very hard to figure out what had happened here or who was responsible until they found her, dead or alive. And so Faust stepped into the room closer to the bed, where a forensic technician was swabbing for fingerprints. The mattress was completely soaked in blood, and on one of the pillows, he could clearly see a bloody handprint. He figured it either belonged to Bonnie or her kidnapper, but they'd have to wait for test results to be sure. Faust stepped back, and he noticed that the sheets had been partially pulled off the bed and were sort of balled up on the middle of the mattress. And to him, it seemed like, given how much blood is in here and the fact that obviously Bonnie is not here, that clearly some sort of long and violent struggle took place in this room. And it seemed to him like the struggle must have originated on the bed, and maybe even the bulk of the struggle was happening on the bed. I mean, it's soaked in blood and the sheets are all messed up. And he's thinking, very likely then Bonnie was in bed when the attack began. Faust also noticed there was a folding knife with a red handle on the mattress, and there was also a purse that had been poured out. There were multiple credit cards and a checkbook that were just sitting on the bed, and the fact that these items were not stolen made Faust think that robbery probably was not part of the motive for whatever happened to Bonnie. But then, something on the floor by the bed caught Faust's eye. After double-checking that the room had already been photographed, Faust put on a pair of gloves and then crouched down and he picked it up. And what it was a small brown button. He carried it over to the closet and dug through Bonnie's clothes that were in there, and the button didn't seem to match anything that she owned. And so based on where it was found in the room, Faust thought, this button must have come off of somebody's clothes in the middle of this attack. It obviously could belong to Bonnie. It could have come off of what she was wearing and maybe is still wearing. Or this button could have come off of the attacker's clothes. And so Faust gave the button to a forensics officer and told him to bag it up. Then he kept looking around. And in the midst of all the blood that had been sprayed all over the room, he noticed there was a clear trail of red droplets that snaked across the carpet. The trail led to a sliding glass door that led into the backyard. And when he tried to open it, he realized it was already unlocked. The forensics officer told him that nobody had touched that door all morning, so it must have been unlocked before anybody arrived. Faust slid the door open and stepped out into the backyard, and he followed the trail of blood across the grass all the way to a door that led into the garage. He noticed there were no drag marks in the grass, so Bonnie's attacker must have been carrying her, which sort of naturally suggested that whoever did this likely was bigger and stronger than Bonnie. But also, judging from the photos he'd seen on the walls, Bonnie was very petite, so really that didn't narrow it down very much. A lot of people could potentially lift Bonnie and carry her. Faust reached the door that led into the garage, and he turned the knob, and it was unlocked. He opened it up, and when he looked inside, there wasn't a car in there. But the trail of blood clearly went into the garage at least a few feet before it disappeared, so it seemed like the suspect had literally carried Bonnie in here, loaded her into the car that likely was in here and now was not, and they drove it away, carrying Bonnie with them. And so Faust knew his best shot at finding Bonnie was to, 1, identify the car that would normally be in this garage, and then once you have the identity of the car, to go find it. Once Faust had done his initial sweep of the house, he went outside and he crouched down next to Bonnie's 2 younger kids, Candace and Brandon. And both kids were still very shaken up and totally confused. And so Faust, very gently, asked them about the last time they had seen their mother. And Candace said it was around maybe 11:45 the night before, when their mom had gone to bed. But she also added that maybe around 3 a.m., she and her brother Brandon were still up watching TV in the living room, and their mom had shouted from her bedroom for them to turn off the TV and go to bed. She said that when their mom did that, they did get up, they turned off the TV, and they went to their own bedrooms and went to sleep. And both kids said they didn't hear or see anything until they woke up later that morning and found what they found in their mother's bedroom. And so this gave Faust something to work with, because it meant, if what the kids were saying was true, that Bonnie must have disappeared sometime after 3 a.m., because that's when she yelled to her kids at 3. Plus, if the suspect came in through that back sliding door that went right into Bonnie's room, and they were able to do so without waking up the kids, and then after the attack being able to find very likely Bonnie's car keys, because that's the assumption, they found her keys and then loaded Bonnie into the car and drove off, again without waking anybody in the house, it's suggested that whoever did this, they likely were relatively familiar with the layout of the house and had probably been there before. So maybe this is somebody that they all knew. Faust pointed to the blood that was on Candace and Brandon's shirts, and he asked them where it came from. And Candace would admit that before she called 911, she and her brother had desperately gone looking for their mom in the room, in this horrible bloody bedroom, but they couldn't find her, and in their efforts to find her, they had gotten blood on themselves. Now, of course, Faust understood that these kids had been through this horribly traumatic thing, and they were just looking for their mom, but he also now knew that very likely their crime scene was contaminated now because the kids went in there and touched a bunch of stuff. But of course, he did not tell the kids that he was in any way annoyed with them or that they had done anything wrong. Instead, he just told the kids to go inside and change their clothes and then give the clothes that had blood on them to the forensics techs because they needed to collect them as evidence. And he also told the kids to not go anywhere near their mother's bedroom. Candace nodded and stood up and grabbed her little brother by the hand. And as they walked back towards the house, a sheriff's deputy came up to Faust and told the detective that he should also make sure to talk to Bonnie's oldest child. She had a 15-year-old son whose name was Bradley. That evening, Detective Faust paced down the hallway of the Pima County Juvenile Court Center, holding a file folder in his hand. When he opened the door to a small office, a teenage boy was already there waiting, and Faust recognized him from the mugshot in the folder he had as Bradley Sanborn, Bonnie's oldest child. Faust walked in, and as gently as he could, he told Bradley that his mother was missing. And based on the blood and the knife they'd found in her bedroom, she'd likely been viciously attacked, kidnapped, and she could even be dead. So Faust knew that Bradley could not have attacked his mother because he'd been here in the juvenile detention center the whole time the attack took place. But Faust had done some digging on Bradley's friends. He slapped the file folder he was carrying down onto the desk in front of Bradley and began flipping through it, showing Bradley the information he'd found about, in particular, his friend Jason Horbachevsky. Jason was a known gang member, and according to several informants, he was known for carrying a knife around. And sometimes, apparently, he would pull that knife out and stab himself in the side of the head. And so Faust wondered out loud if the knife they'd found in Bonnie's bedroom was Bradley's friend Jason's. And maybe the attack on her was retribution for his mother calling the cops on Jason and Bradley that morning. But when Faust looked at Bradley for his reaction, he saw there were all these tears rolling down his cheeks, and Bradley choked out that he really didn't know anything. And as much as he argued with his mom, he would never hurt her. To Faust, Bradley's reaction actually seemed really genuine, and so he immediately figured that if the gang Jason was a part of, was responsible for whatever happened to Bonnie, Bradley appeared out of the loop. And so to get a better read on this situation, Faust felt like, trying to ask Bradley questions was not going to go very far. Instead, he would just go to Jason and talk to him. Later that same night, Faust sat in the station with a cup of coffee, combing through records on Bradley and also on Jason and Jason's gang. After speaking to Bradley earlier, Faust had immediately tried to locate and interview Jason, which proved to be much more difficult than he'd anticipated. He knew Jason was not in police custody since he'd been released pretty much immediately after the payphone debacle. But Jason also was not at any addresses that he'd been associated with in the past, so it was hard to tell where he even was. So, a few hours ago, Faust had sent out officers to speak to as many members of Jason's gang as possible to see if they knew where he was, and also to see if they knew anything about Bonnie. Now, so far, they had not located Jason, and nobody had brought anything up about Bonnie. But just then, Faust's office door opened, and a deputy told him there was someone he really ought to speak to that was out in the lobby. And so Faust got up, he went in the lobby, and who was waiting for him but none other than Jason. When Faust walked out there, Jason stood up from his chair, acting cocky and confident, and told Faust that he'd heard the sheriff's department was looking for him, and he was there to prove he had nothing to hide. And Faust, he didn't even bother asking where Jason had been. Instead, he just led him into an interrogation room, and when he sat down across from his newest suspect, he noticed the buttons on Jason's shirt. They were small and brown, just like the button that was found on Bonnie's bedroom floor. And also, a few of the buttons on his shirt appeared to be missing. Now, Faust controlled his excitement and didn't show it, and decided pretty much right away that he was not going to ask about the button, at least not at first. He didn't want to overplay his hand. Instead, he started the interview by asking Jason some standard questions about his relationship with Bradley, and also by extension, his relationship with Bonnie, Bradley's mom, and also where Jason was at the time of the attack. And Jason would admit that he was mad about Bonnie calling the police on him and Bradley. But he didn't have some big plan to get revenge. He insisted that he didn't know where Bonnie was or what had happened to her, and he'd been at home asleep on the night she was attacked. And at the end of the interview, he agreed to give Faust a DNA sample, and he even turned over his shirt with the missing brown buttons for forensic analysis. And so after that, Faust released Jason and decided it was time to call it a day. You know those moments right before you start something new, when you're staring at the idea, running through every worst-case scenario, and wondering if you're making a huge mistake? That feeling of doubt and uncertainty can be paralyzing. But looking back, making that leap, despite the fear I had, was one of the best decisions I ever made when I started this Mr. Ballin adventure. Because sometimes the scariest step forward is the one that changes everything. Starting something new isn't just hard, it really is terrifying, especially when you're starting a business. But that's why it helps to have such a great partner like Shopify by your side. Shopify is the commerce platform behind millions of businesses all around the world, from household names like Death Wish Coffee and Magic Spoon to brands just getting started. It's time to turn those what-ifs into sales with Shopify today. Sign up for your $1 per month trial today at shopify.com/MrBallin. Go to shopify.com/MrBallin. Again, that's shopify.com/MrBallin. The next morning, Sunday, December 10th, so a day after Bonnie went missing, Faust sat in his office and sorted through all the information his team had collected the day before. While Faust had interviewed Bradley and Jason, other members of his team had spoken to Bonnie's friends, family, and neighbors. But so far, it looked like nobody knew anything that was helpful. A few neighbors had mentioned that the Sanborns had family problems, but apart from that, they all said Bonnie seemed nice, and they had no idea who would want to hurt her. Faust continued reading, looking for some kind of clue in all the interviews, when his office phone rang. He picked it up, and the man on the line sounded terrified, and he said he had a tip in the Bonnie Sanborn case. The man explained that earlier that morning, he'd seen a news report about Bonnie's disappearance and how the detectives were looking for her car, which the police had learned was a light blue Chrysler. And he said that just the day before, he and his wife had actually passed a car just like that on their morning run. It was abandoned on the side of the road in the desert just outside of town. He said at the time, he and his wife had not gotten too close to the car, and they really hadn't thought much of it until they had seen this news report. And so after seeing the report just a few minutes ago, he and his wife had gone back to the desert to see if the car was still there. And he said not only was the car still there, but when they walked up close, they could see in the back seat what appeared to be a woman's body. Faust immediately wrote down the car's location, and when he looked at a map, he realized it was only about a half-mile away from Bonnie's house. He thanked the man, hung up the phone, and then he got in his car and he raced out toward the desert. And when he got past the edge of town into the open desert, he saw right up ahead a light blue Chrysler parked in the sand. He stopped his car on the shoulder near the car, he got out, and he approached the Chrysler, and he peered through the window, and almost immediately, he did see a woman's body. It was Bonnie's body, and she was slumped over in the back seat, just as the man had said. Bonnie's arms were bound behind her back, and there was a sock stuffed in her mouth, and the lower half of her body was naked. And for Faust, in seeing this, he wasn't surprised, but at the same time, he had held out hope that maybe Bonnie was alive. Just seeing her dead in such a horrible way in the back of this car was it was heartbreaking. And so Faust went back to his car, he radioed the station, and he waited until a forensics team arrived. And then at that point, he went back over to the Chrysler, and he began to examine the body. Faust put on gloves, and he leaned into the car, and he lifted up Bonnie's head. And he found there were wounds all over her skull, as if she'd been repeatedly struck in the head with something very sharp. And her partial nudity made it seem likely that she was also sexually assaulted. There were also clear defensive wounds on her hands and forearms, which suggested she had fought back hard against her killer. One of the forensics officers pulled out a black light and began running it across the back seat of the car to check for potential DNA evidence. And Faust watched as the forensics officer ran the light over Bonnie's leg, and it lit up a spot. And the officer told Faust that almost definitely that spot was the killer's semen. And so he swabbed the area and put the swab into an evidence bag and told Faust that in a matter of maybe a few weeks, they should get the DNA profile back from the lab, and maybe they'd know who their killer was. In the meantime, the fingerprints found in Bonnie's bedroom were analyzed, and they had come back with a match that really surprised Detective Faust. All the fingerprints and that bloody handprint on the pillow belonged to Bonnie's 13-year-old daughter, Candace. And even though Faust really did not want to consider that a 13-year-old girl had in some way helped with a plot to kill her own mother, he now had to consider it, not only because of the handprint and fingerprints, but also because there was a long record of family problems inside of the Sanborn house. Now, obviously, Candace could not have committed this crime on her own, but she certainly could have helped whoever did. So, Faust confronted Candace, and when he did, she just broke down sobbing. She said she had just been really scared and confused and was just looking in the bedroom for her mom and just didn't realize what she was doing by getting her prints everywhere. And looking at this scared teenager, Faust knew that Candace really didn't make sense as a potential suspect here. But he still felt like Bonnie's killer had to be somebody who knew Bonnie personally and had been in her house before. And there was one person who still had not been ruled out: Bonnie's husband, Robert. Later that day, Faust was sitting at his desk with the phone pressed to his ear. He was on hold and had been for some time, and as he tried to tune out the awful music that was playing on the line, he looked down at the handwritten list of airline names and flight numbers that were on his desk. Bonnie's husband, Robert, had been working in Maryland for the past couple of months, and he had not been scheduled to come back home to Tucson on the weekend his wife was killed. But just because he claimed that he had been in Maryland that whole weekend, didn't mean he actually was. There were multiple flights from Maryland back to Tucson that in theory he could have secretly taken to come home, kill his wife, and then go back to work in time for his next shift. So Faust had compiled a list of every single flight Robert could have theoretically taken, and one by one he was calling the airlines to check the passenger manifests. And so far there hadn't been a Robert Sanborn on any of the flights he had checked, and now he'd made it to the very last flight on that list. And just then, the on-hold music suddenly cut out, and the woman on the line told Faust that she had triple-checked, and there was no Robert Sanborn on that flight either, the one from Maryland to Tucson. And he thanked her, hung up, and sighed. Now, keep in mind, this took place before the events that happened on 9/11. Since 9/11, air travel has been much more rigidly controlled, especially in the United States. I mean, security is so much higher. But pre-9/11, that really wasn't the case. I mean, people didn't even necessarily have to show their ID to get on a domestic flight. And so Faust knew right now, even though he's being told that Robert's name didn't show up on the manifest of any of these flights, it didn't really rule him out, because he could have theoretically been traveling under a fake name. But there was a next step that would show if Robert had something to do with this, and that would be to ask Robert for a DNA sample, and hope that when the evidence came back from the lab, it would be conclusive enough to give a clear answer. One morning in early January of 1996, so about a month after Bonnie was murdered, Faust answered his office phone, and he heard a tech from the crime lab on the other end. In the past few weeks, there had been 5 more murders in the Tucson area that Faust and his team were now dealing with. So when the lab tech said he had results in the Bonnie Sanborn case, it actually took Faust a few seconds to remember which murder that was for. But once he remembered, he quickly sat down at his desk and he grabbed a pen to take notes. And he held his breath as the lab tech told him that they had tested the sample found on Bonnie's leg, and it was not a match for her husband Robert, nor was it a match for her son's friend, Jason Horbachevsky. Those brown buttons on Jason's shirt also didn't come back as matching the button that was found in Bonnie's bedroom, so it really was just a coincidence that they looked alike to the naked eye. Faust was disappointed, but he knew this was going to be a possibility, and he had a backup plan. He asked the lab tech to run the DNA sample against the DNA of every sex offender on the state registry to see if there was a match there. But as the crime lab slowly began doing that, they kept calling Faust to update him that they had not found a match yet. And eventually, the search for a DNA match ultimately just stalled, and Faust was pulled onto other cases. And so by that summer, it was looking like Bonnie's murder case might go cold. Then, after 9 months without any progress, an anonymous tip came in. That summer, in September of 1996, Detective Faust sat inside of an interrogation room at the sheriff's department across from a 40-year-old drug dealer named Lyle Winstead. The anonymous tipster had said that Lyle had sold drugs to several people in Bonnie's neighborhood, and he'd said some things about the case that the tipster thought were very concerning. And when Faust had dug through Lyle's records, he'd found that Lyle had a history of violent crimes involving knives. Sitting inside the interrogation room, Lyle seemed obviously nervous and very jumpy, and when Faust started asking him questions about Bonnie's murder, Lyle made excuses for the killer, saying that maybe the killer wasn't such a bad guy, maybe he was just, quote, on a bad trip. Now, Faust thought this was incredibly suspicious to be talking that way, so he asked Lyle for a DNA sample, and he got one, and he sent it off to the crime lab. And Faust had to wait several weeks for the results, and when they finally came in, Lyle Winstead was not a match. And at that point, Faust was feeling really frustrated. I mean, they'd already put in so much work with really nothing to show for it, and he didn't want the momentum on the case to die again. So before he put Bonnie's file back on the shelf, he decided to go back to square one and make sure there wasn't anything he just plain missed. The next month, between all the other cases he was working on, Faust found time to go literally door to door through Bonnie's neighborhood and re-interview everybody his team had already spoken to almost a year ago. Faust knew how gossip spread in quiet communities like this one, and even though nobody had been able to offer any leads the first time around, he wondered if maybe anything unusual might have surfaced since then. So he knocked on one door after another, and eventually, at a house down the street, a woman told him that she didn't know anything personally, but there was a rumor circulating around the neighborhood that he might want to look into. So Faust did. And after so many frustrating dead ends to this point, it was ultimately this rumor that did allow him to solve the case. Based on that rumor, and also DNA and other evidence that was later uncovered, this is what police believe happened to Bonnie Sanborn on December 9th, 1995. Around 2:30 in the morning, Bonnie's killer watched her house from a hiding spot where nobody could see them. The killer knew the Sanborns had been trying to move to Maryland, but the killer felt like before they did go to Maryland, if they did that, there was something the killer had to do. Around 3 a.m., as the killer was watching the house, they saw the light in Bonnie's living room finally go dark. And then the killer saw some movement behind the curtains in one of the bedroom windows, and then that lamp went out, leaving the entire house completely dark. The killer had intentionally waited for this moment. They wanted to make sure that not just Bonnie, but her children were asleep by the time they went inside. And so now that the lights were off and that it seemed like the coast was clear, the killer grabbed their flex ties and also their chipping hammer and then began making their way towards the home. A chipping hammer is a very particular type of hammer that has a sort of typical one side that you would use to strike something, but the back of that hammer is sharp, almost like a pickaxe. And so with this barbaric tool they were about to use in hand, they slowly crept their way across Bonnie's backyard right up to the sliding glass door at the back of the house. And they found it was unlocked, just like they thought it would be. After all, they'd been to this house before, they sort of understood this one typically stayed unlocked, and they also knew what was on the other side of this door. It was Bonnie's bedroom. After sliding open the door, the killer stepped in, and they found Bonnie, asleep under the covers in her bed. And so thinking here was their chance, the killer began moving towards the bed. But as they stepped closer, a floorboard creaked, and Bonnie stirred awake. And she rolled over and looked in the direction of the creaking sound and made eye contact with the killer, and the killer knew they had to strike. Bonnie tried to fight back, but it was no use. The killer completely overpowered her. Once Bonnie stopped struggling, but before she stopped breathing, the killer used those flex ties to bind her hands behind her back. Then, as she was laying there, unable to defend herself, they searched around for her purse, and when they found it, they dumped it out on the bed, and after they had emptied it, they found her car keys. And so they grabbed the keys, and then the killer picked up Bonnie, still very much alive, and they carried her out that sliding door into the backyard and then out into the garage. There, they used her car keys to unlock Bonnie's car, the blue Chrysler, and they put Bonnie in the back seat. Then they hopped in the driver's seat and they drove the car out into the desert, where they parked on the side of the road. When the killer was done with Bonnie, they simply got out of the car and left it where it was and walked back into town. And as the sun began to rise, the killer wandered right back down Bonnie Street in the direction of the Sanborn house. It would turn out Detective Faust had been so focused on finding the killer amongst Bonnie's immediate family and friends that he really hadn't even considered somebody else who was literally physically closest to the Sanborns, her across-the-street neighbor, 22-year-old Freddie Royval. Now, Freddie was not actually, emotionally close with the Sanborns, but he and his dad had, in the past, gone out of their way to help Bonnie, by doing some repair work at her house. But what Faust had learned when he had gone back and re-interviewed all the people on the street to see if he had missed something, one of the other neighbors who was not remotely involved in what happened to Bonnie told Faust that there was actually a rumor that Freddie had found Bonnie attractive. And there was also another rumor floating around that Faust learned that previously a woman had been assaulted by a younger man in this neighborhood and that maybe it was Freddie. Now, it's unknown if Freddie actually was the subject of that second rumor, but it was enough for Faust and the police to go collect DNA samples from every young man on the block, and wouldn't you know it, Freddie's DNA came back as a match. Freddie Royval was arrested in January of 1997, a little over a year after Bonnie's murder. He was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. So click here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya.